Hello and welcome to this latest edition of the Liverpool Library. Today we're discussing Geoff Twentyman's Secret Diary of a Liverpool Scout, and I'm delighted to say that joining me on the show, Geoff's son Will and author Simon Hughes. Welcome to the show, guys. How did this book come about?
Must have been about 18 months ago. Will came to Sport Media, who I work for, and proposed this idea about the book. Obviously he showed the original diary, and I had a look at it and thought, it's a unique opportunity. And soon enough, I started, contacting people and interviewing people, and it just kind of, snowballed from there, really.
How difficult was it for you, though? It must have been quite a challenge being so young and to write this book.
Yeah, it was. It's quite hard, I suppose, because especially if you're writing something about Liverpool's history, some people might say, well, you weren't there, but I suppose that's a challenge in itself, just to convince people that I suppose worthy of writing the book. But in terms of writing the book itself, it was quite difficult because there's so many people that you needed to speak to for this particular one, and getting contacts for hundreds of footballers who might not necessarily want to speak to you. But having said that, near enough everyone that I tried to contact were quite helpful and didn't refuse an interview, and I think they found the idea of the book quite unique as well. So it wasn't too bad once get going.
Well, there are a lot of Liverpool books out there. What makes this one so different?
I think this one, I think the diversity of the whole story. I think the fact that the beginning of him being like a wrestling champion up in Cumberland, and then starting playing with Ivor Broadish. I mean, Ivor Broadish alone, who's got a bit of a history, who was the manager at 23 at Carlisle. And then he eventually sold himself to Sunderland, and the man who replaced him was Bill. And I think the relationship early with Bill Shankly in 1949 is just the beginning. And I thought the whole, the whole journey was a fascinating story,
And how much support did you have from Will and from the rest of the family?
Yeah, he was, on every day, I suppose, on the phone, trying to find out what was going on with the book. In terms of the family, again, great. I mean, without Will's help, it would never have happened, I suppose.
How important was it for you that this story, your father's story, was told?
Well, for me, on a personal basis, me being the youngest of the 4 children that my parents had, I started my family quite late, just with travelling and other things. And I've got 2 boys of my own, Hal and Taylor, and they never met my father. So, obviously I've done it for my mother, and I've done it for them. It's a good little memory for them to look, in short time they can look back and maybe get to know my father, So I'm pleased it's done now. Like, every time I pick the book up, I can hear my father speaking. It's quite comforting, really. And I'm very fortunate to do such a thing. I'm quite honoured, really. It's been a great experience.
Tell us a little bit about your dad then, as a person.
My father was quite a quiet individual. He didn't really go around ranting and raving. Anything he did, he let other people decide. And he was away from home a long time. He was away up in Scotland, and my mother obviously brought us up. And but my dad, he was a great guy. Obviously, he was a talented man, played a lot of games for Liverpool, and he had a lot of ability, and it was fascinating. I think only now, later on, sort of the last sort of half of my life I'm going through now, I've really sort of, been focusing on what my dad did more than when I was younger, But that's the way you are when you're younger, I think. I don't think you realise how important, the role my father had at Liverpool, Was it difficult to appreciate the role that he had when you were so young? I think so. I think my brother, he was like 7 years older than me. I think my brother was a bit more aware of it, But I can remember the conversations we had. He's quite a fascinating chap to listen to. I mean, Phil Thompson and other guys would say, he could speak to me dad, about a lot of things. I think the main factor with me dad, whatever he told you, was always the truth. There was never any romance in it, He'd always, if he told you something, it was a sure, true tale,
Must have been fascinating for you, Simon. So it was difficult as well to write a book about someone who you haven't met.
Yeah.
But fascinating to go through the archives and go through these diaries as a fan.
Well, the diary itself, it's a lost kind of artefact of Liverpool's history. I don't think anybody had seen it apart from Billy for the past 5 years. I mean, I hadn't been in the Liverpool Museum or anything like that, so it was fascinating initially just looking at the names that they looked at. Obviously there's the ones there that they did sign, but quite a lot of players that they didn't sign, which I found personally more interesting, because you've got names there like in the 60s, Francis Lee, which I think had been reported quite a bit anyway around the time, and he ends up obviously at City. The 70s, Andy Gray, Gordon McQueen, Jerry Francis, Trevor Francis. Obviously getting to interview these people was just, you know, I enjoyed that in itself. Like I said, that the book, the original diary, it just looks like an old family album, doesn't it? There's no like, there's no any detail even in the notes that he makes. It's just a short statement on each player. I think the one on Joey Jones was ungainly, but gives it his all, or something like that anyway, and that couldn't sum him up any better. And shortly after that, there's a date on there he signed.
We'll go back to when you were younger. Were you allowed to ask your dad about the players that he was looking at?
As I said earlier, you know, it was always a thing that we never really, as I've said earlier in other interviews, you never, you know, signed the Official Secrets Act as such, but my dad would always tell us things more or less just before it was about to happen, you know, like Alan Hansen and things. But I think it's hard to describe, he just took everything for granted, you know, like going into the club as a youngster. You know, I just remember vivid things. I remember they never always done meals at the club. I remember the payphone in the players' lounge, GB Case feeding 2 pences into the payphone. I remember Phil Thompson slurping at his soup at the dinner table. You know, Terry McDermott had the newspaper with all the horse racing and things, you know. Well,
the book's predominantly about Geoff as a scout, but tell us what you learnt about him as a footballer.
Well, he had kind of a moderate career, really. There wasn't... when I say moderate, I mean he played for Liverpool, but it was at a time when they weren't doing particularly well, and you know they got relegated not long after he signed for Liverpool. That was in '53, was it?
Yeah, '53, yeah, December '53. Yeah. So
he was at Liverpool during all the time when they were in the second division, as it was then, and then when Bill Shankly was appointed, Geoff, funnily enough, was one of the first people out the door, just because as a matter of course he'd agreed to go before Shankly was there.
Tell us about that relationship with Bill Shankly.
With Bill, well, my dad and Bill, I think the enthusiasm alone from Bill really struck me dad at an early age, and the understanding they had between themselves. I think what Bill did with my father in 1949 at Carlisle, he'd done 15 years later with Ron Yates at Liverpool. I think he had similar type of things, of like you could put a guy in and build a side round him. So we put my dad in as skipper as well as he did with Ron Yates 15 years later, and they'd give you 100%. And I think, you know, that was a thing that they understood right from that early age. And, you know, my dad repaid him again later on when he come back as chief scout, you know. What
tempted him to come back to Liverpool as a scout?
Well, I think it was just being in the right place at the right time. I think, you know, my father had gone through this period of being at Hartlepool, and you know he'd got in the way of Len Shackleton and Jackie Milburn taking over with Brian Clough coming in at Hartlepool, and I think my father was at a stage where I think he'd lost a little bit of direction, and the same day after Norman Lowe had gone to America, who was the chief scout at Liverpool at the time, Bill had dropped me dad a line, and I think my father had gone down to Liverpool from Carlisle with our last £5 note basically, which I think was about the quarter of a man's wage then. And Bill offered the job to me dad, and that was 1967.
And what was the reaction amongst the family?
Well, I think it was relief, you know. I mean, I was only young. I think at the time when my dad had got finished at Hartlepool, I think all my brothers and sisters were scattered all around because they had nowhere to live, because my dad had rented his house out at Carlisle and he couldn't get the tenants out. So I think it was a relief, I think, more than anything I would have thought. So we went to live in Maghull, because when my father played for Liverpool, he lived in Huyton and Roby, where all the players lived. And then, you know, things started, and it was like you know, another section of the history between my dad and Bill, you know.
Simon, we'll talk about the specifics of the players who he brought to Liverpool, but just how important was this role for Geoff?
Well, at the time, it was massive for Liverpool because he came in '67. Everybody knows that the Liverpool team kind of broke up after the Watford defeat in '70. So I think Bill Shankly, you know, understood that some of the players, even at that stage, were maybe, you know, coming towards the end. So everybody knows the rebuilding process that went on after that Watford defeat. So there's a 3-year period there where Geoff was out and about looking at players. I think towards the end of the '60s, the first two that came through were Ray Clements and Alec Lindsay. And then after the 1970 defeat to Watford, soon enough there was, you know, a raft of players coming in. So that team in the '70s was completely shaped by Twentyman and his eye for a player.
Okay, we'll talk more about that in just a moment. It's time for a quick break now, but plenty more from Will and Simon when we return. Welcome back to the Liverpool Library. I'm with Will Twentyman and Simon Hughes discussing Geoff Twentyman's secret diary of a Liverpool scout. Now Simon, Geoff was chief scout between 67 and 86. Have you any idea just how many players he looked at?
Well, according to the diary, there's only probably about 250 names within that original diary, but I don't think it's, you know, a definitive list of people that he did look at, because as I found out when I was researching the book, there's a lot of players that he mentioned in newspaper cuttings that he looked at but aren't mentioned in the original diary. So as far as I know, I mean, he had an army of scouts that worked under him, and when travelling around the country, they could have diaries themselves. I think the key is to remember that obviously Geoff was the chief scout, but there were a lot of other scouts that were working underneath him, and they probably spotted some players first, and then Geoff went and had the final say on some of them. I think Geoff's main role was to go up to Scotland and look there, and I think his records in that area was, you know, pretty phenomenal really, at a time when Scottish football was, there was a lot of good players there, whereas whether it's the same now, I'm not sure.
Well, just how much research was involved for both of you then to try and get this entirely accurate?
It was always a labour of love for me, you know. I had the diary from my father finishing at Anfield, and it was always a thing that I was going to do, but it was just a case of when. But I don't know, it was always a thing, you know. My father, we lived football in our family, and it was an absolute pleasure to hear my dad talk about players and what he looked for in a player. You know, he'd look for a player who'd approach the ball, you know, someone with a bit of pace, you know, a good striker of the ball, and obviously, you know, having two good feet was always a bonus, because I think it was a thing that my father had. He was equally blessed with two good feet, and it was something he always tried to look for, and a lot of people always made fun of my father's phrase of goes both ways, which was a terminology that, you know, he struck the ball with both feet. And I think Alan Kennedy and a few other guys, when my father made that rare appearance at Melwood, they'd shout to me, Dad, who have you seen this week, Geoff? You know, does he go both ways? And they'd be laughing. But I think short time after, they'd be worried sick in case my father had seen somebody better than them, you know.
Simon, reading the book as well, the northern soul that he looked for in players.
Yeah, I think that was definitely something that, you know, was instilled in him from Bill Shankly. I think he realised that the Liverpool fans would identify more with players from the north and including Scotland. I think from the time Geoff was at the club, I think the only player that Liverpool signed that had any moderate success was Paul Walsh. He was obviously a Cockney. But aside from that, there was hardly anyone from the south that he looked at. I think that was partly as well because I think Shankly understood that it was a bit easier for them to settle if they were not too far away. I think, you know, Scunthorpe was one that they kept on going back. There was a load of Scunthorpe players that they looked at aside from Ray Clements and Kevin Keegan. And then, you know, he spent so much time up in like East Fife and Forfar. It was just ridiculous. He must have been there every other weekend. I mean, he used it. It was the 4-Cortina, wasn't it? Like, which was passed down from Bill Shankly, and it had, you know, it was all battered, and it was, you know, sometimes I don't think he could drive it, could he? But he managed to do the mileage in it, and it was like a horrible orange, gaudy coloured car. So, I mean, he was inconspicuous in the ground, but when he was going up there, I think people must have recognised that car from a mile off, you know.
It was all about finding the best players that Liverpool could afford as well, and not live beyond the club's means at that time. Yeah,
they missed out on Francis Lee because I think Bolton wanted a bit too much money at the time, and I think Shankly's remit was to find the best players who were young enough and cheap enough. I mean, I suppose that's quite broad, but Francis Lee had a bit of a reputation, you know, even in the mid 60s, because he'd made his debut as a 16-year-old and he'd had enough experience. I think that the experience is another thing as well. Like John Toshak was 21, but he played for Wales, played in Europe for Cardiff, because it was at a time when they qualified through the Welsh Cup. So that he played in all these stadiums across Europe, and he knew that would bode well, you know, at Anfield when they were playing in European matches.
Well, the focus now is very much on finding the complete player, but your father seemed to look for players who were 3/4 of the way there, as you say in the book.
Yeah, I think as Simon said, he favoured the Scottish boys, you know, Gary Gillespie and things. I remember he always said to me, when we left school, and you know, you didn't get an apprenticeship at Liverpool or Everton. He always used to say to a lot of lads of that age, you know, don't be worrying about, you get yourself a trade, and then what you want to be doing is carrying on playing football, and when you reach the age of 19, when you're at your strongest, he said that's when you really need to show yourself. And he always, that 19 to 21 sort of period was his time when he could see whether the finished article was nearly there, you know. And he said, as a fallback, if you've got a trade, a plumber or whatever, he said, you've got something to cover you later on in life. He said, because it's a life which is only going to last for a period of time, football, you know. So he always had a good answer for everything, my father, you know. He was good that way. But he look, as Simon said earlier, looking at players, I mean, Terry McDermott at Bury in 1970, I think it was only up until like the 1974 FA Cup final against Newcastle that Shanks had said to me, Dad, we should have signed that lad when you said, Geoff, you know. But, you know, you couldn't sign everybody. Keith Well, I think he was at Millwall at the time, and my dad said to Bill, I think you should be, you know, reckoning around about the £80,000 mark, and a short time after he went to Chelsea, I think, for 100,000 did he sign him?
I think the Terry McDermott one's the most interesting one in some ways, because he was playing for Kirby Boys, and he was only, him and another lad were the only two lads in that team that hadn't been picked up by any clubs at all. And he ended up obviously signing for Liverpool and having the most successful career out of them, all of them. I think John McLaughlin, who I think he played about 50 times for Liverpool, he was in that Kirby Boys team, and he was considered to be, you know, a world beater, which, you know, he was a very good player, but I think Terry wasn't really regarded that highly at the time, because his physique wasn't big enough, and eventually he went to Bury and, like Will said, like learned his trade in the lower leagues and ended up signing for Liverpool and won European Cups.
Will, we've talked about how your father looked for players at the best price, but one player who, in a way, he put his reputation on the line for was Ian Rush, wasn't
he? Ian Rush was a bit of a risk, I think, at the time. You know, he'd gone to Chester, my dad, to see Ian play, and he knew what he could do. And I think my dad had a chat with Bob, who was the boss at the time, and he took Bob, and Bob had obviously agreed with the potential. And my dad had suggested, why don't you let Chester keep hold of him till the end of the season? Because they're getting a bit fed up, these clubs like Chester and Tranmere, where when they have a good player, they only last a short time and they go to the bigger clubs. And Bob said, oh no, we'll sign him clean now and we'll have him, you know. But prior to signing him, my father used to always like to sort of see what the player's character was about. And my father went round on this particular occasion to see this old chap, George, or whatever his name was, who run the baths and swept the tie-ups up. And he said to this guy, he said, see this young player Ian Rush, George, he said, what's he like as a lad? Is he a good lad? And George said, well, put it this way, Geoff. He said, when we play away from home, he said, Ian's the only player that gives the coach driver a lift on and off the bus with the skip, with the kit in. So my dad said, well, that'll do for me. So, you know, they signed him, and I think he played in the reserves for a short spell. And I think my father got challenged one day in the corridors of Anfield from a particular director on criticising whether they'd wasted money on this dud Rush, I think the phrase was. And my father said, well, you know, give him time and he'll prove you wrong, you know. Yeah,
Bob Paisley had an offer, didn't he, on the table from Crystal Palace,
really?
After he hadn't, you know, scored in 12 months, and I think he considered it, but you know, persevered in the end, and you know, an injury, I can't remember who it was, David Johnson maybe got injured, and Rush got his chance, and then, you know, the rest is history, I suppose.
You know, that was the way things were in them days, you know, and
I just think it's the unique trust, isn't it, that's built up, and
right.
Like,
it was
just
a big
trusting
team,
somebody.
It was a full unit that worked together, you know, and I think that's what people have got to understand and realise, and that's half the reason why we've done the book. I couldn't put up with all these stories from mature men about, you know, they weren't accurate stories, that weren't accurate about players that I think they just thought they'd come knocking at the door looking for a game on a Saturday, and it was a lot more to it than that, you know. And that's half the reason why we've done the book, because I needed to clarify a lot of things that people just didn't understand. They were the Liverpool fans, but all they were interested in was, you know, the silverware, and I think there was a bit more to it than that for me, you know.
How fascinating was it for you then, Simon, and how interesting will it be for other Liverpool fans to read about the stories behind the story of the glory days?
That was the big thing for me. I didn't want it to become just a retold story of Liverpool's glory years, because that's been written about so many times, and you know, it's getting a bit repetitive, I think now, and I've tried to, like you say, get the stories behind it, and it's not just, like you said before, the players that Liverpool signs, the players that didn't sign, and what happened in their careers. So it's each interview within the book is like a biographical interview of each player's career, effectively. And I think there's about 32 interviews within the book, and then all the other people that I've spoken to as well, with the Twentyman story running alongside it. I think that was the big thing for me in terms of making sure that it's not just a Liverpool glory story. How
proud are you of it then?
Well, I think it's got to be arguably one of the best things I've ever done in my life, you know, really, you know, I'm so pleased I've done it now. It's a funny thing, it's a bit of a, well, you could say it's a dream, you know, you've always thought about doing it. But all credit to Simon, I think, you know, you can read books and you can read books, but I think the way Simon's done it, you know, it's been perfectly executed, you know.
And in your eyes, Simon, how important was Geoff in his role as Chief Scout?
Yeah, I think you can't underestimate it at all. Like I tried to say before, I think it's the unique trust between all the people at Liverpool, including Geoff and the scouts that worked underneath him. I think everything put together made Liverpool successful. It wasn't just one person, or like at any club now, I think everybody knows that you need everybody pulling in the same direction. And I think that was the big thing about Liverpool then, and I think you know, Geoff Twentyman was a massive part of that.
Okay, gents, we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks very much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you both. That's all we've got time for on this latest edition of the Liverpool Library. Geoff Twentyman's Secret Diary of a Liverpool Scout is available at all good bookshops. Until next time, though, it's goodbye for now.